For centuries before the formation of cities, Italy was a land of villages, and the outside world impinged on life only fitfully. Urban life appeared here long after it had emerged in other parts of the Mediterranean basin. Over time, some settlements slowly became larger and more complex socially, economically, and politically, and the leaders of these more highly structured towns and villages gloried in their connections with the wider Mediterranean world. In the 7th and 6th centuries BC, some communities achieved the status of cities, with elaborate social systems, monumental buildings and temples, and formal public spaces. Others would follow in later centuries. These urban centers would long remain the chief centers of power in Italy. Italy and the Mediterranean world. Italy, Italia in Latin, is a long peninsula, encompassing slightly less than 100,000 square miles, 260,000 square kilometers, that juts out from the northern or European coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In the far north, the Alps, Latin Alpes, divide Italy from the rest of Europe. To their south, the valley of the Po, Latin Padus, Italy's largest river, contains land with great agricultural potential. Except for the plains along the eastern coast, the Apennine Mountains separate the Po Valley from the rest of Italy. Peninsular Italy begins south of the Po Valley. The peninsula is about 650 miles in length, 1,040 kilometers, and it never is more than 125 miles wide, 200 kilometers. The sea is always fairly close. The Apennines dominate the peninsula. From their northwestern end, where they meet the Western Alps and the sea, these mountains run almost due east in a narrow and virtually unbroken line that nearly reaches the Adriatic Sea. This portion of the chain separates the Po Valley from Etruria, an early center of urban life. As they approach the eastern coast, the mountains turn sharply to the south, running in a series of parallel ridges that in places reach almost 10,000 feet in height, 3,000 m. In its northern half, the main chain lies much nearer to the Adriatic than it does to the Tyrrhenian Sea on the western side of the peninsula. South of Rome, however, the mountain chain gradually leaves the eastern coast and approaches the western, ending in the southwestern promontory of Bruttium. The mountains on the island of Sicily, Latin Sicilia, separated from the mainland only by a narrow strait, are a continuation of this chain, which ultimately reappears in the mountains of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco in North Africa. The first great centers of population and civilization arose in the coastal regions. The Adriatic coast, with few harbors and little space for large-scale settlement, was for a long time backward. For much of their length, the Apennines leave no more than a narrow coastal plain. Only in the south, where the mountains approach the Tyrrhenian coast more closely than they do the Adriatic, are there broad plains. Much of the plateau of Apulia, however, is semi-arid. Only a few river valleys here were sufficiently fertile and well-watered to support substantial populations. The peninsula's southern, Ionian, shore also has narrow plains or semi-arid ones. The mountains of Bruttium closely confine some coastal communities. Even so, in some more favored areas, sufficient land and water could be found for large settlements. Towns appeared early here, and some became wealthy and important. The west coast was the most favored. Here, well-watered and fertile lands proved capable of supporting large populations. Many harbors gave access to the sea, and 4 rivers, the Arnus, modern Arno, Tiberis, modern English, Tiber, Liris, and Vulturnus, all navigable in small boats, barges, and rafts for some distance, gave easy passage to the interior. 3 of the regions facing the Tyrrhenian Sea had especially prominent places in the history of ancient Italy. Etruria, the land of the ancient Etruscans, is the northernmost. This region of fertile hills, forests, and lakes, roughly bounded by the Arno and Tiber rivers, saw some of the earliest centers of urban life. 2 important plains occupy the coast to its south. First comes Latium. East to west, the Latin plain ran from the sea to the foothills of the Apennines. North to south, it covered the stretch of coast between the lower Tiber River and the northern limits of Campania. Rome itself, Latin Roma, would rise here on the banks of the Tiber, just across the river from the southernmost Etruscan centers. Centering on the Bay of Naples and its hinterland, the Campanian plain is the southernmost of the 3 regions. The surrounding mountains and seas did not isolate the peninsula. Although the Alps seem quite formidable from the Italian side, Large-scale movement across them has always been possible, and the inhabitants of the Valley have often had closer cultural links and firmer and friendlier relations with groups across the northern mountains than they did with peoples to their south. From an early period, ships have traveled from Italy across the Mediterranean, moving goods, people, ideas, and institutions. Much of this traffic was only local, but at times long-distance commerce developed and flourished. Before Rome succeeded in dominating the peninsula, seaborne connections flourished only fitfully along the Adriatic, although the mouth of the Po River on occasion received much trade. The peninsula's southern and western shores were more open. Good harbors could be found along the coasts of the Ionian and Tyrrhenian seas, and the richer and more extensive plains provided valuable hinterlands. Italy occupies a strategic point in the Mediterranean world. The island of Sicily, off the southwest tip of the peninsula, divides the Mediterranean Sea in two, and maritime traffic between east and west necessarily passes by the island. Ships seeking to enter the Tyrrhenian Sea from the Ionian and Sicilian seas had to pass through the narrow Straits of Messina before they could proceed north along the Italian coast or west along the north shore of Sicily. This passage could be dangerous. Greek writers would place there the whirlpool Charybdis and the monster Scylla, who fed on ships' crews. Other important routes passed to the south of the island, eventually funneling through the passage between western Sicily and Cape Bon in modern Tunisia, about 100 miles away, 160 kilometers. The island could also serve as a virtual bridge between Italy and North Africa, facilitating north-south traffic across the central Mediterranean. In later periods, maritime powers often fought for control of the island, and the state that ultimately would dominate it could expand east and west with some ease. The evidence. Archaeological investigations provide the evidence for the history of Italy before the appearance of cities and organized states, because writing develops only as urban life was emerging. The material remains of ancient cultures can provide insights into important aspects of societies. How people organized and arranged their houses and their settlements, the ways they earned their living, the objects they made and how they used them, the commercial and cultural contacts they established with neighbors and with more distant peoples. At first glance, moreover, the recovery of the physical traces of the lives of earlier inhabitants seems to avoid many of the problems associated with the interpretation of often biased and value-laden texts. But archaeological evidence also has its own limitations. Only a few activities leave clear physical traces, and the remains are often very difficult to date and to interpret. Archaeologists, moreover, often restrict their investigations to a limited range of sites. Thus, tombs and monumental public buildings for long received more attention than ordinary houses or settlements. Archaeologists now often focus more on settlements and houses, and they regularly employ surface surveys, for the Romans involving the systematic examination of traces on the surface left by centuries of human use, to learn more about settlement patterns. At the same time, in order to shed light on the environment and the economy, excavators have sought to recover plant and animal remains and to subject them to increasingly sophisticated analysis. Yet there are limits to these approaches. Much of life remains inaccessible. Excavations and surveys usually reveal more about a society's technology, settlement patterns, and economy than they do about the events that shaped the inhabitants of a community, about the political and social institutions and practices that organized their lives, and about the system of beliefs that guided relationships with neighbors, family members, rulers, and ruled. This necessary emphasis on the material, technical, and economic aspects of communities has a further and important consequence. Archaeologists often identify cultures on the basis of a number of shared traits, practices, and forms in funerary rites, in technology, in material goods, and in economic life. But these archaeological cultures should not be confused with cultures defined through other means. After all, groups that differ in many ways can construct similar buildings, they can make virtually identical tools and ornaments, and they can earn their livings in many of the same ways. Artifacts and techniques, in other words, can cross ethnic, linguistic, and political borders. Archaeological cultures, then, are collections of traits in material goods, in technology, in funerary practices, in settlement forms, and in economic life. They are not political or linguistic units, nor need they have a single ethnic identity, either in their own eyes or in the opinions of their neighbors. Finally, the broader significance of finds is not always apparent, and major problems in interpretation can arise. Many of the most significant of the recovered objects have been found in tombs. The burial rites of many ancient communities required that grave goods be interred with the deceased, but the extent to which tombs and grave goods reflect the organization of society is controversial. Some burials, for example, are richer than others in the same cemetery, and the usual inference is that the deceased in life stood out in wealth and in status. In other cemeteries, burials may have been very similar in layout and in their contents. Here, scholars often suggest that the associated settlements had a more egalitarian social structure. Neither of these inferences is certain. Burials are the remains of a burial rite, and fashion or belief may well have had more influence on deposits than other factors. At the same time, it is far from certain that all members of settlements received formal burials of the kind that have left detectable and datable traces in the archaeological record. What survives, then, may be evidence for the practices of only a portion of the inhabitants of the towns and villages associated with a particular cemetery. Votive deposits, another important category of evidence, provide similar problems in interpretation. In Italy and in much of the Mediterranean world, worshippers deposited objects in sacred places to fulfill a vow or to thank the presiding deity for favors. When these sanctuaries, shrines, caves, or groves became crowded with gifts, those in charge would make room by burying the offerings. Again, the finds primarily illuminate the range of early Italy 5 objects deemed suitable as a gift to a god, although they may also reveal something about the kinds of objects available in the community and the techniques involved in their manufacture. Italy before the city. The basic pattern of social and economic life in peninsular Italy was established early. For centuries after the first appearance of agriculture around 400 BC, Italy was a land of villages with simple forms of economic and social organization. Settlements were very small, usually with no more than a few huts and outbuildings and less than 100 inhabitants. Villagers planted barley and several types of wheat, and they raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. Their technology was simple and signs of occupational specialization are few. For millennia, Italian communities produced pottery in a range of styles and forms. At other times and places, the production of pottery could be a highly skilled craft, and devices were in use which require a high degree of expertise, such as the potter's wheel, for example, which allows for more regular shapes, and high-temperature kilns, which provide harder and finer surfaces. In Italy, neither the potter's wheel nor high-temperature kilns were used before the appearance of cities. In earlier centuries, too, specialized potters were almost certainly not involved in the craft. The manufacture of ceramics, in other words, was primarily a household activity. Tools necessary in everyday life were generally made of wood, bone, or stone. The social and political organization of these villages was relatively simple and egalitarian. There are no signs of marked distinctions in wealth, nor are there indications that adults made their living in markedly different ways. Elsewhere and at other times, kinship, age, and gender often served as the chief means of internal regulation in communities of this scale. The existence of larger tribal entities is uncertain. Links between neighboring settlements could easily be managed within structures of kinship and intermarriage. The use of metals provides the only clear example of more sophisticated techniques and some craft specialization. Around 2000, copper tools and ornaments appear in the material remains. In the succeeding early, circa 1800 to 1600, and middle, circa 1600 to 1300, Bronze Ages, a limited range of tools, weapons, and ornaments were made of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Metalworking was a task for specialists, since it requires both expertise and organization. Materials must be acquired, often from great distances, and the processes of refining the ore and casting the metal require knowledge and skill. In the Middle Bronze Age, throughout peninsular Italy, artifacts of copper and bronze exhibit much standardization in form and techniques of manufacture. This may indicate that experts moved from village to village in search of markets for their skills. Italian metallurgy also shows marked influences from outside the peninsula. To the east of Italy, in the Balkans and beyond, complex and highly organized the Roman societies, ruled by kings with the assistance of bureaucratic and military elites, were firmly established in the 2nd millennium BC. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece exercised considerable influence on some of the cultures of Central Europe and the Central and Western Mediterranean, motivated, at least in part, by the need to acquire metals. Mycenaean pottery appears in Sardinia, where copper was mined, as early as the 14th century, and there are clear signs of contact, probably through intermediaries, with the metal-producing regions of Central Europe and Britain. At this time, metallurgical techniques and styles came to exhibit a high degree of standardization over great distances and across many societies. Since the Mycenaeans' search for metals seems to have encouraged a movement of craftsmen and of manufactured objects between the metal-producing and metalworking regions of Central Europe, Spain, Italy, and Greece. Most Italian communities, smaller and simpler economically, socially, and politically than their Eastern contemporaries, probably participated in this world only peripherally. Exchanges fell off sharply when Mycenaean power began to fade in the 12th and 11th centuries. Outside influences did not affect all areas of Italy equally. Mycenaean merchants and settlers were active along some of the coasts of Italy and Sicily. Scattered finds of pottery have been found along the southern half of the Adriatic shore, as well as along the south coast of Italy and its west coast as far north as the Bay of Naples, along the east coast of Sicily, and on the Lipari Islands. In southern Italy and eastern Sicily, where relations were most intense, settlers from the east may actually have founded settlements. Here, local communities may also have imitated some aspects of Mycenaean social organization. A ruling warrior elite seems to have emerged in some communities, and in a few places larger and more elaborate dwellings may indicate the presence of native rulers. Central Italy did not develop as rapidly or in quite the same way. During the recent Bronze Age, roughly the 13th and early 12th centuries, settlements here grew in size and in number, an indication that the population was increasing. A typical village may now have had a population in excess of 100. The inhabitants of many settlements placed their dwellings on hilltops, presumably for reasons of defense, and occasionally they strengthened their position further with ditches and dikes, a practice that was less frequent earlier. The Iron Age in Etruria, Latium, and Campania. Beginning in the 9th century, there occurred a series of developments in Italy leading, by the 7th century, to the appearance of the cities that would turn out to dominate Italian history. Archaeologists refer to the years between the start of the 9th century and the last third of the 8th as the Iron Age. The extraction of metal from the ore and the working of the iron require complex and sophisticated early Italy 7 techniques, and the making of steel is an even more elaborate process. Iron has important advantages over bronze. Iron ore is relatively common, so that the acquisition of this metal is a much simpler and cheaper process. When used in the form of steel, tools and weapons can be made harder and better able to retain an edge. Eventually, the use of iron would lead to cheaper products, which can be employed for a wider range of functions and by a larger portion of the population. For centuries after the introduction of iron, however, a wide range of objects, utilitarian and otherwise, continued to be made of bronze, wood, bone, and stone. In the 9th and 8th centuries, Etruria, Latium, and Campania saw the rise of an interrelated group of cultures that would eventually develop into major centers of power and wealth. In Etruria, the Iron Age culture of these centuries is known as Villanovan, from the estate near modern Bologna, where archaeologists first found traces of its material culture. Beyond Etruria, Villanovan settlements also appear in some areas just across the Apennines, such as around modern Bologna especially, and in Campania, where Capua and other centers show close connections with southern Etruria by sea or by the land route up the valleys of the Liris, Anio, and Tiber rivers. One of Villanovan culture's most significant traits was the greatly increased size of its settlements. Beginning around 900, certain ones began to grow larger, sometimes through the abandonment of earlier villages and the concentration of population at a few centers. For the most part, these central places were on easily defended plateaus, where the natural features of the site, occasionally reinforced by ditches and banks, formed the primary defense. In southern Etruria, which has been more fully researched, settlements at the future sites of Caera, Tarquinii, and Veii may each have had over 1,000 inhabitants. To judge by the distance between them, the chief centers may have controlled territories as large as 350 to 750 square miles, 900 to 1,940 square kilometers. At first, land away from the core may have only been sparsely inhabited, But by the 8th century some large settlements seem to have established smaller secondary ones near the limits of their territory, perhaps as a way of securing control over their borders, or because the main center was now too densely inhabited to accommodate further population growth. In their internal organization, these new and larger settlements still remained relatively simple, consisting of clusters of huts separated by small open spaces. Each of the smaller clusters that together made up the whole may have represented a kinship group or the inhabitants of an earlier, now abandoned village. Settlements often had several cemeteries, each used by a single cluster of huts or by a few neighboring groups, a sign that they perceived some common identity. Farming and the raising of pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats remained the primary economic activities. The absence of the potters will probably shows that the manufacture of pottery had yet to develop as an occupational specialty. Metalwork, on the other hand, plainly was a matter for specialists who performed their functions beyond their own and neighboring villages. Since these settlements show no sign of elaborate social systems or clearly identifiable distinctions in the Romans' wealth, let alone of formal layouts and public buildings, all marks of the cities that would emerge in the 8th and 7th centuries, they are best characterized as proto-urban rather than as urban. Placed between Villanovan Etruria and Campania, Latium developed its own regional culture around 1000. This Latial culture was once seen as a variant of Proto-Villanovan and Villanovan, and it shares many features with them. For the most part, Latin settlements were located on hills or on spurs that projected from the Apennines into the plain. Iron Age settlements in Latium generally were smaller than their counterparts in Etruria. The cluster of villages occupying the future site of the Latin city of Gabii offers the most detailed picture of a Latin settlement of the 9th and early 8th centuries. Gabii was on a narrow isthmus separating two small lakes. Before the formation of the city, a cluster of small settlements filled the isthmus and part of the rim of the northern lake. Cemeteries were located at each end of the settled zone. In all likelihood, no village in Latium ever had more than 100 inhabitants at any point during the 9th century. After about 800, however, a number of settlements there, like their Villanovan neighbors, began to grow larger because of internal growth and the abandonment of outlying villages. For the 9th and early 8th centuries, the burials at Gabii provide some evidence for the social order of a Latin settlement. Graves in its two cemeteries were arranged by right and by the age and gender of the occupant. Adult men lie at the center. Here cremation was the exclusive rite in one cemetery and the dominant practice in the other. Around the center were situated the graves of women and of young men. Here, inhumation was the dominant practice. Young women interred on the periphery were often buried with bronze objects and ornaments of glass paste and of amber. These cemeteries seem to have been family burial grounds, and the different practices show that certain status distinctions were determined by age and by gender. Yet there are signs that some men possessed a distinctive position in the community. In the male cremation burials, miniaturized weapons, such as swords and spears, are common. They are not found in male inhumation graves, and the occupants may have claimed some special status related to warfare. Toward the end of the 9th century, these cremation burials end, but the status groups associated with them may well have persisted, expressing their social position in new ways. See next section. Greeks and Phoenicians in the central Mediterranean. Outside contacts markedly affected both the pace and the nature of change in the centers of the Villanovan and Latial cultures. In the late 9th century, as well as in the 8th, maritime contact with the eastern Mediterranean again became a prominent factor in the development of central Italian societies. The Phoenicians led the way. The coastal regions of the modern states of Syria and Lebanon on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean were their homeland, and the first traces of early Italy their civilization appear there around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The Phoenicians' world centered on a number of cities, each with its own king, priests, palace, and temples, and each ruling the surrounding countryside. Long-distance trade by land and by sea was important in the social and political order of a Phoenician city-state. Kings and temple priesthoods participated, as did associations of rich and powerful merchants. Around 1000, the leaders of some of these cities, especially Tyre and Sidon, the most powerful of the Phoenician states, began to send out settlers and trading expeditions, first to the nearby coast of Cyprus, but soon as far away as Spain. Eventually, Phoenician settlers would establish a series of new cities along the coasts of western Sicily, Sardinia, northern Africa, and southern Spain. Carthage, Latin, Carthago, probably founded around 800 in the territory of modern Tunisia, would become the most powerful of these new settlements and Rome's great rival. Greeks followed shortly afterward. After the collapse of Mycenaean civilization during the 12th century, contacts between Italy and the Greek world had declined rapidly. Trade and population revived during the 9th century, and, at the same time, larger, richer, and more complex communities started to form again, which over generations would develop into city-states. Around 800, contacts between Greece and Italy began to increase. By 775, some Greeks established a settlement on the island of Pithecusa in the Bay of Naples, and a few Phoenicians may also have settled there. In this new community, and in others that would be founded later, trade and access to metals played an important role. Pithecusa shows signs of ironworking on a large scale, but the search for farmland was vital too, and before long would become the most important factor. Greek settlements on the mainland soon followed. Cumae, founded around 750, was the first, and others would follow in the 7th, 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries. Eventually the eastern, southeastern, and northern coasts of Sicily would be dotted with Greek city-states, as would the south and west coasts of Italy as far north as Campania. Later, Romans would call these mainland areas of Greek settlement Great Greece. Latin, Magna Graecia. In the 7th and 6th centuries, the Greek colonies here, like other communities in Greece and in the coastal regions of central Italy, would follow more or less parallel paths that led to the formation of city-states. The rise of cities. Beginning in the middle of the 8th century and continuing over the next 3 centuries, Etruria, Latium, and Campania witnessed a series of political, social, and cultural innovations that would result in the formation of the first central Italian city-states. The appearance of this new form of social and political life was a broad phenomenon that characterized many regions and ethnic groups. In Italy, city-states became the dominant form of organization in Etruria, Latium, Campania, the Romans and the Greek regions of Sicily and southern Italy. Outside the peninsula, city-states would cover Greece and the western and southwestern coasts of Asia Minor and many of the areas in which Phoenicians settled. Broad similarities in form, however, should not mask the great diversity in detail and the many local variations that could be found in important aspects of urban life. Cities, in other words, could share many of the ways they organized government, war, and religion without really being very much alike. A city-state was both a kind of settlement and a form of political, military, and social organization. Fully developed city-states usually possessed a clearly defined urban core, with special areas designated for elite and for communal ends, and cemeteries encircling it. Beyond, its surrounding territory contains scattered shrines, hamlets, and farmsteads, along with a few settlements, smaller than the central city and without a fully developed communal life. The scale of these city-states varied greatly. In the contemporary Greek world, a typical one may have had approximately 1,000 inhabitants and perhaps a territory of around 40 square miles, 100 square kilometers. Its army would have numbered no more than a few hundred men. In central Italy, many of the emerging city-states would have been somewhat larger. Many certainly controlled more territory than was the case in Greece, and, by the end of the 6th century, some had populations of several tens of thousands. Some formal political organization was essential. In a typical city-state, elite residences, political life, and communal religious activity were all concentrated in and about the center. Here, members of elite families displayed their status, competed with their peers, and exercised leadership over their own followers, even, on occasion, over the city as a whole. At first, aristocratic families and their retainers dominated most emerging city-states. In the 7th and 6th centuries, kings reigned in some. By the early 5th century, certain cities possessed formal offices and priesthoods, filled by a process of election, and held for terms of 1 year. Arrangements such as these would eventually become standard in communities with a city-state form of organization. City-states emerged through a number of interrelated processes. First, an aristocracy with its own distinctive way of life developed. This process almost certainly began before it becomes visible in the archaeological remains. Over time, aristocratic families concentrated in the larger settlements, making them centers of wealth and power. The leaders of these more powerful communities began to construct larger and more elaborate buildings, and to set aside formal spaces where the population of the settlement and its surrounding countryside would gather for occasions deemed important to the city. Eventually, institutions regulating the community as a whole appeared and began to overshadow individual families and their leaders. In central Italy, scholars divide the formative age of the city-state into two broad phases: the Orientalizing period, c. 725 to 580, and the Archaic period, c. 580 to 480. In its origins, this division has much to do with artistic styles and with clear, direct early Italy 11 foreign influences. The Orientalizing period earned its name because of the appearance in tombs and votive deposits of luxury goods imported from the Orient, Greece, Syria, and Egypt, or of locally made imitations of these imports. These two periods also mark, if only roughly, other developmental stages. In the earlier period, monumental architecture commissioned by the elite becomes conspicuous, as does literacy. From around 600, the basic communal institutions of the city-state come into view, the governing elite broadens in some ways, and large-scale warfare between cities begins. The course of these developments probably varied considerably from city to city, and the evidence rarely allows a full picture of the process to be reconstructed for any one place. The history of Rome in this period, however, is the best documented of all. See Chapter 2. Beginning of writing. During the 8th century, writing came to Italy, and written texts now supplement the archaeological evidence. Around 740, someone in the Greek settlement of Pithecusa scratched into the surface of a jug a short text in Aramaic, a script and language of Syria. At about the same time, mourners placed in a grave a cup inscribed in Greek, one of the earliest examples of the Greek alphabet found anywhere in the Mediterranean world. The Greek language and script were to have a long life in Italy and would exert great influence there. By 700, texts in one or another of the languages of Italy itself appear, written in scripts derived from the Greek. The earliest known Etruscan documents date from the very beginning of the 7th century. Known texts of the 7th and 6th centuries now number in the many hundreds. Early documents in Latin are less common. Only a very few can be placed in the 7th century, and less than 100 in the 6th and 5th centuries. The surviving texts of the 8th through the 5th centuries are generally short, difficult to interpret, hard to date, and not very informative. Inscribed on stone, bronze, or pottery, their contents generally are brief and formulaic, and the languages in which they are written are often not well understood today. Some identify the occupants of tombs. Others proclaim the owner or maker of an object. Still others record the dedication of gifts placed in temples and shrines. A few are longer, but these are only preserved in fragments for the most part, and their contents are obscure. No evidence survives of a bureaucratic use for writing, such as one finds in some other Mediterranean societies. Despite the absence of a bureaucratic purpose, however, writing in Italy was closely associated with the elites of its cities, and the earliest written texts accompany their activities. Appearance of an elite. Toward the end of the 8th century, some families in the coastal regions of Etruria, Latium, and Campania began to demonstrate that they possessed wealth, the Roman status, and power on a scale far greater than others in their communities had attained. These emerging elite families, like many others in the Mediterranean world at the time, sought to distinguish themselves from others in their communities through a distinctive way of life with the appropriate personal ornaments, weapons, and other marks of status. Many of the objects and the imagery of wealth and power associated with them had their origins in Greece and the Near East, where they were used in a similar fashion by leading social groups. Tombs provide the earliest signs of these families and their pretensions. In the 8th century, tombs with rich deposits of grave goods become more common. At Gabii, some tombs of the mid-8th century are markedly richer than others, and a few exceptionally rich tombs contain chariots. By the end of the century, powerful families proclaimed their position in their town or village in the so-called princely burials. These new princely burials emphasize families and their place in their communities. The builders of many of the new tombs constructed them so that they could receive multiple burials over the years, a sign that each was intended to be the burial site of a family or a lineage. Grave goods reveal a broad concern among the elite for conspicuous displays of wealth and status, and the willingness to expend much wealth in pursuit of these ends. Tombs and burials, after all, are arranged by the survivors, and in them the kin of the deceased can make clear statements about the social position they think that the dead occupied in life, not to mention the position which the survivors themselves wish to be seen as maintaining. Families often placed their tombs along the main roads into the settlement, where they could be seen and admired by others. Tombs and their contents, then, would have proclaimed to passers-by the wealth and status of those interred within, and of their families as well. Tombs in the new manner were much more elaborate and required a larger commitment of resources than was the case earlier. At Etruscan Caira in the 7th century, one family constructed a tomb, known today as the Regalini Galassi tomb, with a corridor over 120 feet long, 36 meters, and 6 feet, 1.8 meters, wide and a burial chamber on either side of this aisle. Its builders cut the lowest part of the wall into the underlying rock, and built the upper portion with large stone blocks that formed a vault over the aisle. Finally, they covered the entire structure with a large earth mound or tumulus about 150 feet, 45 meters, in diameter, and set up a low stone wall surrounding its base. The contents of the tombs also served to distinguish the new burials from their predecessors and from those of their less fortunate contemporaries. Elite tombs often contain large quantities of metal objects and fine pottery, imported or of local manufacture. At Castel di Decima in Latium, mourners in the late 8th century buried a young man with personal ornaments of silver and bronze, iron weapons, a chariot, bronze tripods, other bronze vessels, and a range of Greek and Phoenician pottery. In another, later burial in the same cemetery, a young woman was interred with over 90 bronzes and imported ceramics, while her body was covered with gold, silver, and amber jewelry. Most finds of Greek and early Italy 13 Phoenician pottery, jewelry, and other metal work, and of locally produced imitations too, have been made in tombs of this kind. The new aristocratic tombs were not a single artistic or social phenomenon, nor were they restricted to only one ethnic or linguistic group. Instead, they attest to the formation of a broad central Italian elite culture. Burials on this pattern can be found along the west coast of Italy from the north of Etruria to the south of Campania, and later they can be found well inland too. The practice certainly crossed linguistic divides. It is present in areas whose inhabitants spoke Etruscan, and in others where Latin was the dominant language. Under this broad diffusion, there could be much local variation in funerary rites and practices, as well as in the layout and construction of tombs. Some were larger than the Regalini Galassi, while many others were smaller. Some had many burial chambers, while others had only one. Funeral rites, whether cremation or inhumation, varied from place to place and sometimes from tomb to tomb, as did the wooden or stone coffins or sarcophagi in which bodies were buried, and the funerary urns in which ashes were placed. What these burials have in common are the prestige objects deposited in graves and many of the decorative themes on walls and on sarcophagi. Over time, much of this original unity would break down, as local elites each followed their own course of development. Associated with these ways of death was an aristocratic way of life. In the emerging cities, members of the leading families also came to adopt and display a distinctive lifestyle, which marked them off from the mass of the population and often united them more or less closely with the leading families in other communities. Again, evidence from tombs is central, since mourners deposited in the tombs objects that played a prominent role in an aristocratic self-image, and especially objects used in the ceremonies that defined and proclaimed this image. Thus, horses, chariots, rich armor and weapons, personal ornaments, and the equipment for feasting and drinking were all particularly important in this connection. In Italy, much of this new lifestyle remains obscure, but a comparison with the Greek world, which influenced Italy greatly, may help to clarify some of its features. Greek aristocrats proclaimed their position in the community through elaborate displays of family, wealth, and virtue. Skill and leadership in war also played a prominent place in this self-image. Male members saw themselves as heroes, which explains in part the popularity of epics such as Homer's Iliad. Warlike display was certainly important among central Italian elites too. Their burials regularly contained arms and armor, often in large quantities, and the representations of combat to be found on a range of objects may well reflect claims to fighting skills and leadership in war. Weapons were not even limited to male tombs, and their presence in women's tombs could indicate that skill in war was seen as a family attribute rather than just an individual one. Certain finds, such as the large bronze shields often embossed with elaborate designs, are too light and fragile for use in battle, although they are highly suitable for display on ceremonial occasions. Ceremonial drinking and feasting occupied a prominent place in the aristocratic lifestyle in many parts of the Mediterranean world. In Greece, male aristocrats held ceremonial drinking bouts or symposia, singular, symposium, in which poetry, song, displays of wit and invective and conversation all had an important place. In these gatherings, elite males in a community and their guests from elsewhere created links among themselves and proclaimed their distinction from others. Essential implements in such gatherings, bowls for mixing wine, cups, and tripods, were often expensive, and they served as symbols of a special and highly desirable way of life. The bulk of the bronze vessels and tripods included in Italian elite graves, along with most of the imported ceramics and their local imitations, were designed and made specifically for these occasions, which suggests that formal feasting and drinking occupied a similar position in the self-definition of the Italian elite. In Greece, guests at symposia were virtually all male. In the Italian world, artistic representations show that wives participated too. Extravagance was a prominent feature of elite burials of the 8th and 7th centuries, but their 6th and 5th century successors were on a much reduced level. The princely burials of the 8th and 7th centuries are relatively rare. Clearly, they held the remains of only a tiny portion of the population. The elite tombs of the following centuries exhibit a wider range of sizes, and grave goods generally are fewer, less costly, and less exotic. Despite the reduced scale, these burials were still the prerogative of a select group, and their builders shared some values with their 7th century predecessors. Construction required a commitment and display of resources on a scale that most contemporaries could not match. Burial chambers often replicated rooms in the houses that the deceased would have occupied when alive. The walls of many such chambers, moreover, were covered with elaborate frescoes, certainly a task calling for skilled artisans. Scenes of feasting were common, illustrating some continuity with earlier ideals. More families may have interred their members in a relatively expensive manner than was the case earlier. At Etruscan Vulcinii, for example, inscriptions deposited between 550 and 500 reveal the presence of at least 90 families rich enough to build tombs. Placing a tomb was no longer solely the choice of the family. At some major centers, formal cemeteries or necropolis, singular, necropolis, located on the margins of the settlement, contained the burials, while grids of streets determined the placing of tombs. In later periods, communal institutions overshadowed any single elite family, and the broadening of the elite from the 6th century may well reveal an early stage in this process. Cities and monumental architecture. In the 9th and 8th centuries, settlements in Etruria, Latium, and Campania consisted of collections of huts with no traces of planning, formal organization, or public buildings, let alone private dwellings on a significantly larger scale than their neighbors. From the beginning of the 7th century, however, members of elite families began to construct larger, more elaborate, and more expensive structures in the main centers of population. They also began to lay out and ornament the public spaces that would define communal life for centuries, all signs of their ability to muster resources and labor on an increasingly lavish scale. Residences of the elite form the earliest among these new kinds of edifices that are visible in the archaeological record. From the beginning of the 7th century, the wealthy and powerful started to construct larger houses made of brick or stone and roofed with terracotta tiles. Some possessed elaborate and colorful exterior ornamentation. These new structures, built with techniques that had reached Italy from the eastern Mediterranean, required more capital and more labor than did earlier dwellings. Surrounded by lesser structures, they would have proclaimed their owner's status much more clearly. Later, intermediate groups in the towns, not as wealthy or as powerful but still well off, would copy these structures, although on a smaller scale. A few buildings display wealth and status more appropriate to rulers than to aristocrats, perhaps the residences of the kings that legends and histories later associated with this time. The large structure constructed around 575 at Malo in the countryside near modern Siena provides the clearest example. This so-called palace consisted of 4 blocks of rooms around a central courtyard. The courtyard itself was surrounded on 3 sides by a colonnade, while the fourth side probably held a shrine, and it may also have had a place for a throne. Builders covered the rooms with over 30,000 square feet, 2,800 SQM, of terracotta roof tiles, which would have required a formidable outlay of resources in fuel, kilns, and labor. The palace at Malo had an earlier, less well-known 7th century predecessor, which was destroyed by fire. Aquarasa, near modern Viterbo, saw the construction of a similar house during the 6th century. At Rome, another palace, known as the Regia, was built according to the same general plan toward the end of the 7th century. The elaborate decorations of the palace at Malo reveal some of its functions and much of the same ethos already seen in tombs and in grave goods. The builders of the palace adorned walls and roof lines with elaborate terracotta sculptures and friezes, some depicting human and divine figures and real or mythical animals, and others representing banquets, processions, horse races, and groups of warriors marching behind leaders in chariots, all prominent forms of elite behavior and display. Certain scenes show standing and seated human figures apparently engaged in some ceremony or early Italy 17 figure 1.3 plan of the palace at Malo public business, and one carries a special curved staff or lituus that would serve in Etruria and Latium as a symbol of office for nearly 1,000 years. The ways in which the palace at Malo was used are not entirely clear. It may have served as a residence for a ruler or for the leading family in the town. Certainly, some of the ceremonial activities depicted in the friezes must have taken place within its courtyard. Fragments of fine pottery attest to banquets and symposia. The presence of a shrine indicates that religious rites were performed in the palace too. The Regia at Rome also possessed shrines to several gods. Possibly the ruler held court there in the presence of his followers and the leaders of other prominent lineages. Thus, it may have been the regular site of feasts, religious ceremonies, and small-scale political meetings. Slightly later, the ruling families in many of the emerging cities began to establish larger and more elaborate meeting places for the residents of their cities. Structures like Malo could have accommodated relatively few participants and observers. In later periods, the leaders of cities regularly gathered the citizens in public assemblies to announce political decisions and to mobilize popular support for them. Leaders also staged elaborate public and ceremonial displays of their status and of their public roles. In these ceremonies, religious rituals addressed to the gods of the city often played a prominent part, for the performance of such rites also emphasized the leading role of the elite families that dominated civic life. Large-scale gatherings of the residents of a community, and the rituals that often accompanied them, served as a visual sign of the increasing unity of the city-state. In this connection, the governing elites of many emerging city-states established well-defined public spaces, together with temples and shrines surrounding them, to serve as the stage for their activities and the center of such limited government as these communities possessed. As part of this development, the ruling elites of central Italy made the cult places of their communities grander and grander. From around 600, the inhabitants of some cities and towns began to build large, elaborate temples to their gods. These edifices, which shared many features with the earlier palaces, especially in their decorations, were often located on the central square of a settlement or on a hill overlooking it, where they would dominate the city's physical appearance. Although there could be considerable variation in ornament and in details, temples in central Italy generally were built upon a high platform or podium, fronted by a porch with columns. Crowning the structure were a peaked roof of terracotta tiles and such terracotta decorations as statues, friezes, and antefixes. In later periods, these structures had an important place in communal identity, and they served functions beyond the strictly religious. In Rome, for example, officials performed many of their duties here, and speakers addressed their audience from a temple podium, where they would be highly visible. These new cult places in some ways were an elaboration and a monumentalization of earlier practices. Organized cults did not begin with the 7th century. Excavations at the sites of some 6th and 5th century temples have unearthed votive deposits that contained objects much older than the temples. In the Latin city of Satricum, the area later occupied by a temple contained a simple hut of 9th century date, with a hearth, that may have served as a cult place. Around the middle of the 7th century, this hut was replaced by a rectangular stone building with terracotta roof decorations. A votive model of the structure clearly shows it to have been a temple. Comparable development from hut to temple may also be seen at Velletri, Lanuvium, and Gabii. At other places, sacred groves or open-air altars first occupied the sites of later temples. Temples and open-air shrines formed the stage for many of a city's most important religious rites, and they also provided the site for other elaborate displays of wealth and power by the governing elite. Votive offerings were prominent in central Italian cult places. These objects, offered to thank a god for answering a prayer or for giving some other sign of divine favor, could vary greatly in kind, in expense, and in quality. Individuals occupying a wide range of statuses made dedications, but those made by members of elite families would have stood out. Some of these more prestigious gifts bore inscriptions identifying the person who had made the dedication, one of the earliest uses of writing in Italy, and in the early Italy 19 figure 1.4 this reconstruction of the so-called Portinaccio temple at Vi, built c. 500, illustrates some of the typical features of a central Italian temple. It was built upon a high platform or podium. In front was a deep colonnaded porch, and behind was the chamber or cella where the cult statue of the god and some of the most precious offerings were stored. Along the ridge and edges of the roof, terracotta sculptures were placed, termed acroterial statues after the bases or acroteria on which they stood. The altar would have been somewhere in front of the temple. Most ceremonies here would have been outside, not inside, and public. They would have marked this individual, in the eye of the viewer, as one favored by the god. As wealth came to concentrate in cities and towns, many communities began to expend resources on their defense. For centuries, villages were often located on easily defensible hills or plateaus, which the inhabitants might strengthen with ditches, dikes, and palisades. From the 8th century, some communities began to construct more elaborate and expensive defensive systems. Many fortified themselves by first digging a deep, broad ditch, fossa, and then using the excavated earth to construct a thick, high mound agger inside it. Fossa and agger defenses do not necessarily surround an entire city. In general, only the most vulnerable areas were strengthened in this manner. A few cities built still more elaborate fortifications. At the beginning of the 6th century, the Etruscan city of Vercelli built itself a wall of large mud bricks mounted on a stone base, and in the 6th and 5th centuries, the Etruscan centers of Caere, Tarquinii, Vulci, and Veii built walls with stone blocks. Again, these fortifications seldom extended completely around the settlement. Warfare in the Orientalizing and Archaic periods. The 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries saw major changes in the frequency of warfare, as well as in its scale and degree of organization. The new ways of making war affected not only relations between the emerging cities, but also the role and power of aristocracies, the political and social organization of the communities themselves, and their physical layouts. In the 4th century and later, when our evidence is much better, it is clear that some cities made war in a very formal and highly organized manner. They fielded large armies led by the political leaders of the city as a whole, and these armies fought formal battles in which soldiers were massed in large and regular formations. Before this date, however, simpler and less structured forms of warfare prevailed. There were few or no set battles. Quick raids for cattle and other loot predominated. Warriors served not as members of the community, but rather as followers of an aristocratic leader who had organized the enterprise. While the nature of the transition from one mode of warfare to another is clear enough, the stages and the timing of the shift are very obscure. It was probably a long process with much local and regional variation. From 600, however, the evidence shows traces of an ever-intensifying warfare between cities, while later literary sources even provide the names of prominent leaders in war. Some aspects of the shift stand out more than others. The increasing scale and sophistication of the fortifications that came to surround many communities plainly illustrate both the greater intensity of warfare and the higher levels of organization in war-making. By contrast, shifts in military organization and tactics, and changes in the political and social structures that may have accompanied them, are far more obscure. In the Greek world, which was the source of Imper 20 the Romans' tant innovations, the new way of war-making centered on hoplite infantry, who were protected by body armor or corselets, made either of metal or of leather reinforced with metal, bronze greaves, leg armor, and bronze helmets. These hoplites carried a large circular shield or hoplon, and were armed with both a spear and a sword or dagger. This new equipment, the hoplite panoply, made the warrior less vulnerable to the weapons of others, and so favored close combat over fighting at a distance with weapons that were thrown. At the same time, the panoply made combatants less mobile in the field, so that hoplites fought in a dense formation or phalanx, where warriors were protected and reinforced by those on either side. So long as each soldier kept his place, the phalanx had considerable offensive and defensive power. The new tactic emphasized formal battles over a more fluid warfare of raid and counter-raid. Moreover, warfare between phalanxes generally favored the larger formation over the smaller, so that communities had a positive incentive to increase the number of men serving in their armies. The development of the hoplite phalanx was a long process. The new equipment appeared first, perhaps as early as the last decades of the 8th century, but the phalanx itself developed only slowly, and some communities did not make the full transition to it until the 6th or 5th centuries. The cities of central Italy may have followed a broadly similar course of development. After around 700, weapons and body armor became more expensive, more complex, and perhaps more widely diffused over the adult male population of some communities. In the 8th and 7th centuries, deposits of weapons and armor, or models of them, are common in the wealthier graves. In 7th century graves in Etruria, elements of the hoplite panoply begin to replace equipment of an earlier pattern. By the end of the century, hoplite equipment can be found in aristocratic graves in the coastal regions of Etruria, Latium, and Campania. Around 600, representations of helmeted warriors carrying round shields and moving in dense formations begin to appear on vases and friezes. Finally, in the 6th century, figurines of warriors wearing the hoplite panoply appear in votive deposits, especially in Etruria. The presence of the equipment, however, does not necessarily imply the existence of large armies fighting in regular formations. First, the range of forms for shields, helmets, weapons, and body armor seems too wide and too variable for the degree of standardization often associated with the hoplite phalanx. Moreover, grave goods, votive deposits, and new artistic representations provide very uncertain evidence for changes in tactics. Objects deposited in graves or in sanctuaries are the relics of rites whose relationship to other aspects of communal life must remain somewhat problematic. Proclamations of status were integral to aristocratic funerals, and for a long time warfare of one kind or another held an important place in the self-image and self-representation of Italian elites. Some shields, helmets, and corselets seem too ornate and too fragile ever to have been used in combat. Objects such as these probably had more to do with ceremonial early Italy 21 displays than with the actual conduct of war. Even the presence of serviceable equipment on the hoplite pattern need not imply that the original owner fought in a phalanx, because the prominent exhibition of foreign, and especially Greek, objects or local copies of these items was a notable feature of aristocratic self-presentation. The significance of the dense groups of marching warriors represented on vases or friezes may also be disputed. Some experts view them as depictions of phalanxes marching into battle, while to others they are processions and armed ritual dances. Nevertheless, it is certain that some cities did slowly adopt more regular and larger-scale ways of making war. Perhaps the most obscure aspect of these changes is the matter of leadership and recruitment. Early in the history of the Greek city-state, aristocratic families and factions dominated the life and the decision-making of their communities. Fighting forces consisted of members of the elite and their retinues and dependents, while military leadership was largely a function of the ability to raise and lead a personal armed following. Among the developed Greek city-states of the 5th century, communal institutions such as citizen assemblies and election of officeholders had superseded the earlier aristocratic leadership in many areas of civic life, and communal norms and institutions had come to be central to warfare. To a large degree, equipment was standardized across the army, and military service had become a function of citizenship and wealth rather than merely the result of birth or dependence on a leading family. In the larger cities, at least, adult males were ranked according to wealth in a way that determined eligibility for military service along with a range of other political rights and duties. While serving, hoplites belonged to clearly distinguishable subunits of the phalanx that were organized on the basis of residence. The adult male citizens of the city came to elect their own military leaders, and formally voted on matters of war and peace. In central Italy, certain cities slowly made a similar transition, although some of them may never have taken it very far. In these emerging urban communities, the leading families dominated in war. Just as in the Greek world, The ability to raise a personal military following was a prominent aspect of leadership and an important prop to the power of the rising aristocratic families. Really outstanding individuals, moreover, were able to attract followers from distant places, often younger members of aristocratic families elsewhere, who were looking for adventure, fame, and wealth. In some cities, Rome is the best known. Communal institutions would also come to overshadow individual families in making war. Yet it is possible for armed followings based on a powerful individual or a leading family to coexist for considerable periods of time with other modes of recruitment based on citizenship or residence. Indeed, it is possible that Rome's preeminence, and that of a few other towns, may have been due, to some degree, to its reorganizing while neighbors did not. Social and economic organization. Elite families dominated the social and economic life of their cities just as they did their political, religious, and military organization. The wealth and power of the upper classes rested upon their control over their followers and other dependents as well as over land. Prominent individuals mobilized groups of men for war, led them in battle, and, if successful, distributed the fruits of victory: land, cattle, captives, and the movable goods of the defeated. In peacetime, leading families also assembled dependents to farm their land, guard their herds and flocks, and attend to household tasks. Agriculture was becoming more complex, more capital-intensive, and perhaps more profitable. Beginning in the 8th century, the cultivation of grapevines, so essential to a culture with ceremonial drinking, spread to central Italy, along with the planting of olive trees. Powerful families probably played an important role in this process and in the accumulation of wealth that would have accompanied it. In the late 7th and 6th centuries, potters in Etruscan coastal centers made pottery vessels, amphorae, for the storage of olive oil and wine. Some of these wine amphorae have been found along the coasts of southern France and northeast Spain. Long-term ties of dependency bound many of the inhabitants of the new cities to aristocratic leaders. Links between members of the elite and their followers could be defined in terms of patrons and clients. Ideally, the patron granted protection to his clients, who followed this protector in war and in politics and served him in other ways when appropriate. In some cases, a powerful family may have controlled entire villages or clusters of dwellings in a larger settlement. Early Italy 23, the communities of central Italy possessed what has been called a gentile organization. Romans, for example, belonged to a clan or gens, plural, gentes. At first, a gens consisted of an aristocratic lineage or group of lineages and some of their lesser followers and dependents. A special system of nomenclature characterized groups formed in this fashion. Members were identified by a name or nomen, plural, nomina, that identified their gens, and they also had a first or personal name, the prenomen. Names in this style appear on inscriptions from the 7th century, although it is unclear whether that is a recent development or just the first appearance in writing of an already established practice. All of a city's residents need not have been either aristocrats or dependents of some aristocratic family. In some cities, independent elements of the population could certainly be found. Eventually, they too came to be organized into gentes so that every member of a community would belong to a gens. For many, dependence on the rich and powerful was unavoidable. So long as communal organizations were relatively weak, only powerful families, with their many armed retainers, could offer protection from war and other forms of violence. Debt formed another route to dependency. In many societies of the ancient Mediterranean world, debt established and was intended to establish a long-term relationship between borrower and lender. Farmers who possessed only a small plot of land were highly vulnerable to crop failure, and they had great difficulty in assembling a surplus that would see them through bad years. In the semi-arid environment of much of the Mediterranean basin, crop failures or low yields because of drought were fairly frequent, a circumstance that regular warfare could only aggravate. Many men were forced to turn to their wealthier neighbors for assistance, borrowing to feed their families or to plant their next crop. Debt incurred in this fashion, it should be noted, would probably never be repaid. Debtors would never gain enough wealth to repay in full, and they would continue to need further assistance in lean years. Instead, debt created a permanent relationship in which debtors lost control of their land and their labor, while creditors gained followers and a permanent workforce. In many early city-states of Greece and Italy, debt formed one of the chief sources of social conflict. The production of luxury goods and trade in them too probably focused on elite households. In the Mediterranean world of the time, the specialists who made the prestigious products desired by the rich and powerful were for the most part itinerant. Such specialists made their living, in other words, by moving from place to place, offering their services to the wealthy in each. While employed, they would be supported by their customers, who would maintain them in their households. In the 7th and 6th centuries, some producers of ceramics and metalwork certainly came to Italy from abroad, usually Greece, but on occasion from Phoenician areas too. The leaders of some cities took a clear role in sponsoring and protecting long-distance trade, and the presence of foreign prestige items in sanctuaries and elite tombs confirms that local elites were eager to benefit from such trade. In the 624, the Roman century, Caira and Tarquinii set up secure locations in which foreign merchants could operate, and they also made treaties with other cities to protect shipping. The Greek city of Sybaris, moreover, founded dependent colonies at Laos, Cydrus, and Poseidonia on the west coast of the peninsula, so that merchants could travel from Sybaris to Campania and farther north by land, thus evading the tolls imposed by Rhegium on ships using the narrow straits between Sicily and Italy. One should not imagine, however, that the ruling elites of such cities participated personally in long-distance trade. A desire to own goods from distant places need not imply a personal interest in arranging their acquisition and transport. Indeed, the exchange of goods could be a very complex phenomenon. Members of the Greek upper classes, for example, professed contempt for trade and traders, but they still engaged in exchange with outsiders. In the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries, much of this exchange took the form of gift-giving and of hospitality, which established mutual obligations. Individuals of equivalent social standing in different communities sometimes exchanged gifts, usually items of prestige, and, in the process, recognized each other's social position. Inferiors also gave gifts to their superiors in return for protection and good favor. Foreign traders are known to have given gifts to members of the local elites for just this purpose. Like Greek aristocrats, Roman elites at a later date, see Chapter 5, also professed scorn for commerce and traders, and there are Etruscan inscriptions showing the existence of a similar culture of gift-giving. Leading individuals could benefit from trade without entering into a commercial relationship, and perhaps without even coming into much contact with traders. Italian aristocrats, in other words, were not merchants. Greeks and Etruscans. The 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries were the great age of the Etruscan and Greek cities of Italy and Sicily. In addition to the evidence provided by archaeology and by inscriptions, which often prove to be obscure and uninformative, the histories of these societies are illuminated by a few literary texts. Some of them are even contemporary with the last stages of the Archaic period. They identify major figures and events and shed light on social and political organization. All these texts, however, were composed at a considerable distance from the communities themselves. In Greece, the writing of histories began in the 5th century. In the last third of that century, two of the greatest Greek historians wrote, if only tangentially for the most part, about events in the West. First, while elaborating upon the background to the celebrated clashes between the Persian Empire, the leading power in the eastern Mediterranean at the time, and the Greek city-states, Herodotus, died before 420, described in varying detail the history of several Greek cities of Sicily and southern Italy, and especially of the powerful tyrants who were often their rulers. Second, Thucydides, c. 460 c. 400, outlined early Italy 25 the foundation of the Greek colonies in Sicily, 2 to 3 centuries before he wrote, and commented briefly on their subsequent history as part of his account of the Athenian expedition against Syracuse, the largest Greek city on the island, during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, 431 to 404. Centuries later, other Greek writers, such as Diodorus Siculus, died after 21 BC. A Sicilian Greek himself, and the biographer Plutarch, died after AD 120. Also dealt with events at this early period, using and adapting previous historical works that do not survive today. Unlike the Greeks, the Etruscans are largely silent. Some Etruscans probably did write histories and chronicles of their own cities, but only a few slight traces of these works remain. The cities of coastal Etruria sometimes appear in the writings of Greek and Roman historians. In the Greek texts, the Etruscans appear as enemies, competitors, and pirates, cruel and faithless. The Roman writers were less hostile, but no less ethnocentric. See Chapter 2. Greek cities of southern Italy and Sicily. By the end of the 8th century, some of the Greek colonies of Sicily and southern Italy began to take on the forms of city-states, Greek, polis. Several became notably powerful, dominating extensive hinterlands and large populations. Only a fraction of the inhabitants, however, would have been citizens of the ruling polis, for these Greek cities made sharp distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, and even between the descendants of the first Greek settlers and the offspring of later arrivals. At 6th century Selinus, for example, the original walled enclosure of the 7th century colony, covering under 24 acres/10 hectares, contained temples and a residential district for the elite. Poorer residents, by contrast, lived in a large cluster of crowded dwellings outside the walls, or in scattered houses and villages in the countryside. At the same time, Syracuse had come to dominate a large territory. This comprised the city itself and the lands cultivated directly by its citizens, a number of military strongholds with permanent garrisons, the semi-autonomous Greek colony of Camarina with its own citizens and territory, a number of villages inhabited by native Sicels who had been reduced to the status of serfs working the lands of the governing elite, and finally a few areas where Sicels maintained a semi-autonomous status. Elsewhere, the Greek cities of Gela and Acragas, both on the south coast of Sicily, maintained similar arrangements, as did the South Italian cities of Taras, Latin, Tarentum, Sybaris, and Croton. The Greek cities of Sicily and Magna Graecia suffered from sharp internal divisions. Narrow oligarchies, composed of the descendants of the first settlers, for a long time controlled the best land and the public offices. At Syracuse, they were called the Gamoroi, those who shared the land. In other cities, the governing groups were called the Hippias or horsemen. In addition to these wealthy families, Greeks of a less exalted status formed the citizen body or demos, and their military service could be essential to the survival of the state, although this demos typically had little in the way of political rights. Such divisions, as well as the sharper divide between Greek and non-Greek, made the internal stability of many cities precarious. Civil wars and coups and the expulsion of defeated factions were not uncommon, and civil strife could result in the establishment of a tyranny, the personal rule of a single individual backed by an armed following. From the middle of the 6th century, these Greek city-states of Sicily and southern Italy, already disturbed by internal problems, entered into a period of wider, more serious conflict, into which even non-Greeks were drawn. The more powerful cities, able to dominate the native populations in their hinterlands, began to press on the territories of others. During the 6th century, Sybaris was the most powerful Greek city in Italy. In 510, however, after being weakened by civil strife, it was defeated and destroyed by its neighbor Croton. Then in the 5th century, Rhegium and Locri, both farther west, ended Croton's preeminence. During this century, Syracuse successfully dominated many of its smaller Greek neighbors. Etruscans. Beginning in the late 8th century, a number of communities in southern Etruria, Caere, Tarquinii, Vulci, and Veii, began to develop rapidly into city-states. By the end of the 7th century, others could be found in northern Etruria, at Populonia, Ruzelli, and Volaterrae, as well as inland in the valleys of the Tiber and Arno rivers. These cities possessed a common language, and many features of their government, social organization, and religion were similar. They also had some sense of a shared identity. Yet Etruscan city-states were never united politically, and frequently they were rivals and even enemies. The major centers of Etruria controlled substantial territories. Political power and public cult were concentrated at the core, reducing other settlements in the territory to a subordinate role, or forcing their abandonment when the inhabitants were moved to the city. The larger cities often spread over several hundred acres, although buildings did not occupy all of this space. Smaller dependent settlements, some as extensive as 25 acres, 10 hectares, could be found toward the fringes of a larger community's territory, too far away for the land there to be cultivated by people from the center. Villages occupying less than about 10 acres, 4 hectares, surrounded the central city, as did hamlets or isolated farms that covered 2 to 3 acres, 1 hectare, at most. In certain instances, some lesser settlements contained a religious structure or elite dwelling, and even fortifications. In addition, a few towns of intermediate size, seldom exceeding 100 acres, 40 hectares, preserved a precarious independence in zones that were isolated from major settlements. Most such towns, however, eventually succumbed to their stronger neighbors. Malo was destroyed twice, first c. 600 and finally c. 530. Aquarasa was eclipsed around 500. Shrines in the territories of some cities promoted relations both between communities in Italy and with the outside world. In the Orientalizing period, aristocratic households may have mediated much long-distance trade, but in the 6th century a broader institutional involvement developed in some places. At Gravisci and Pergi, the ports of Tarquinii and Caira respectively, elaborate temple complexes received dedications from local notables, as well as from Greek, Phoenician, Latin, and Etruscan merchants. In some cases, local gods were identified with foreign ones. At Gravisci, the local Turon was equated with the Greek Aphrodite, while at Pergi the Keratin deity Uni was linked with the Phoenician Astarte. Around 500, in a long inscription in Etruscan and Phoenician, the ruler of Caira recorded a dedication he had made. His choice of languages illustrates the importance of Phoenicians here, coming from Carthage perhaps, or from another Western colony. Thus, cult places such as these served as centers of interaction between peoples of different origin under the patronage of the host community. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean at this time, sanctuary sites are known to have filled the same function. Traces of Etruscans are not limited to Etruria. In some places, Etruscan settlements followed Villanovan predecessors, just as they did in Etruria itself. Capua and Nola in Campania, as well as Felsina, modern Bologna, across the Apennines are good examples. New Etruscan centers appeared elsewhere in the Po Valley in the course of the 6th and 5th centuries. Small groups of Etruscans also inhabited places that remained essentially non-Etruscan, because inscriptions in the Etruscan language have been found in many places in Latium, including Rome itself, Campania, and Umbria. In the Archaic period, Etruscan elites were among the most active in Italy, but the nature of their interaction with non-Etruscan communities is not always clear. Some scholars suggest that Etruscan practices spread with the movement of elites and their followers, who would come to dominate a pre-existing community. Some of the Etruscan centers in the north may have begun in just this way. Hatria, from which the Adriatic Sea received its name, and Spina, a major trading center from the closing decades of the 6th century, may originally have been Greek cities. Roman writers of a later date thought that 2 of Rome's last 3 kings were of Etruscan descent, and they believed that some of Rome's core institutions and practices were of Etruscan origin. Even so, it is by no means clear how far the emergence of cities in regions such as Latium is to be credited to Etruscans. In the 7th and 6th centuries, the chief Etruscan communities were among Italy's richest and most powerful urban centers. As such, they would plainly have had marked influence, either imposed directly through the power they exerted over their neighbors, or indirectly through the models they provided for others. The similarity in material culture that many scholars regard as signifying the undoubted presence of an Etruscan elite may rather be due to the formation of an international elite style, one that crossed ethnic boundaries, and was shared by numerous local elites imitating each other to increase their own prestige. By the 30, the Romans' same token, the presence of Etruscan speakers may indicate only that the newly forming city-states in many regions were for a time open to outsiders. The Romans, it should be noted, thought that Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king of Rome and father of the second, came to Rome from Tarquinii as an immigrant, not as a conqueror.